Hello and welcome to episode 172 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. I'm Sarah Says, and I'm opening the episode of the show because Rick is going to be flying solo this week. Spaceship Earth is the center of Epcot, and quite possibly, more than any other ride in Walt Disney World, it is emblematic of the entire purpose of the theme park it anchors. Today, Rick is going to take a deep dive into the attraction, specifically how he would go about updating it. The ride has definitely seen better days, and I think many Disney fans would love to hear some word of a refurbishment or even slight retheme at the D23 Expo coming up in August in Anaheim, California. Before he gets started, this channel has achieved some significant milestones in the almost 3.5 years since we've been putting out weekly episodes. In less than 2 years, we were able to get 500 subscribers, and it took less than a year after that to more than double that number. We want to keep growing, so please make sure you are subscribed to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. In addition to the weekly podcast, we are working on other shows, interviews, and Rick is always posting videos from inside the Orlando theme parks. It just takes a few seconds to make sure you're subscribed. While you do that, like, comment, and tell your friends about our content. We still have big plans, and every single way you can help us is free on your end of things. Right now, I'm going to turn things over to our host, Rick Doherty.
Thank you so much, Sarah Says. I know you've been very busy lately and we haven't been able to have you on the show, but even just doing that intro for us and having your voice back on the podcast really helps us sound better. I appreciate you being here, and we'll have you on for a proper episode sometime real soon. Back in August of 2019, I'd been living in Florida for about a third of a year. While my wife Courtney and I were definitely missing Arizona. I mean, this was the state where it had been our dream to move for quite some time. Still, it certainly was exciting to be living within a 2-hour drive of Walt Disney World. I was still a travel agent at the time, so I was really spoiled. I'd make it a point to visit the parks at least once per week, and I got to claim it was research for my clients. Well, those theme parks were about to get a whole heck of a lot better. We were just a few weeks away from Star Wars Galaxy's Edge officially opening on the East Coast. I'd seen pictures and videos from the Disneyland version, and knowing that the two were almost identical, I was stoked to see this immersive world. To make things even more exciting, the company had just announced a ton of new attractions and experiences at the D23 Expo in Anaheim, California. We're talking Tron Light Cycle Run, Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind, Mary Poppins Cherry Tree Lane, Remy's Ratatouille Adventure, and so many more changes were coming to Walt Disney World. One of those announcements was an update to Spaceship Earth. Disney's chairman of parks, experiences, and products at the time, Bob Chapek, stood in front of a large crowd of Disney fans and explained how the new version of the classic attraction would keep a lot of the same scenes and storylines. Where the current incarnation focuses almost solely on communication, Chapek's plan would be to continue talking about communication, but end it with a focus on storytelling. I think most people believed that this was Disney's way of trying to introduce some more intellectual properties into the second half of the ride. Like everything Disney announces, this was controversial, but it was obvious that the ride needed some TLC. When riding the current incarnation, it can be hard to hear Dame Judi Dench's narration over the clanking of the ride vehicles. The attraction breaks down on occasion, and once you've made it to the top of the geosphere on the ride, your descent is just watching a story on a tiny screen. It was time to bring this show about traveling to the past into the future. Disney even gave fans a closing date for the current version of the attraction so that they could try to enjoy it one last time. May 26th of 2020 was the day Spaceship Earth would close for refurbishment. We all know what happened next. In March of 2020, the park shut down in the midst of a global pandemic. When Walt Disney World reopened in July, Disneyland was still 8 months away from reopening. Crowds at the parks were dramatically limited in those early days. Millions of people lost their jobs and travel was shut down around the globe. While Tron Light Cycle Run, Remy's Ratatouille Adventure, and Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind did eventually open in Walt Disney World, they were delayed by a matter of years, not weeks or months. Many projects were canceled or delayed with no announced intentions to revisit the plans. Spaceship Earth may have actually been the canary in the coal mine when it came to canceled refurbishments and rethemes. A few weeks before the parks reopened, Disney confirmed that Spaceship Earth was going to be available to ride in July of 2020. This was well past that initial May 26th of 2020 refurbishment date. Now we move to the present day, and there's talks of potential new lands coming to Disneyland, Disney's Animal Kingdom, and Magic Kingdom, as well as the need to compete with the opening of Universal's Epic Universe next year. Fans are starting to get excited about the potential for some more big announcements from this year's D23 Expo on August 9th through the 11th of 2024. This could include another look at the most iconic attraction in Epcot. Today I thought I would play some armchair-imagineering and tell you how I think a retooled Spaceship Earth should look. The first thing to address is obviously the narration. There have been 4 fairly iconic voices over the 40-plus years of this attraction. It started with Lawrence Dobkins, who was replaced in 1986 by the legendary Walter Cronkite. In 1994, Jeremy Irons took over from Cronkite, and Dame Judi Dench, the current voice of the attraction, who has also been the ride's only female narrator to this point, grabbed the microphone in 2008. I think we can all agree that telling the story of communication requires a great storyteller. It takes a great voice to summarize tens of thousands of years of exchanging ideas. Here are a couple names that I think would work. Of course, I know a lot of people would love to have Jeremy Irons reprise his role. This would be a good nostalgia pick for people who really love the history of Epcot in particular. Still, I think Disney has shown, especially in recent years, that while the Epcot purist is appreciated as maybe a popcorn bucket purchaser, the main audience, as far as the company is concerned, is still the vacationing family that may not know as much about the park's lore and traditions. 2 voices that are synonymous with big-time Disney intellectual properties are James Earl Jones and Tom Hanks. Either one of them would do an amazing job telling the history of communication and transitioning to the topic of storytelling. James Earl Jones has been Darth Vader and Mufasa. Tom Hanks has played Woody and Walt Disney himself. You know, either one of them would be able to deliver the dry aspects of the script professionally, but also break in with some self-referential jokes. James Earl Jones recently turned 93, so another great excuse to give him the job would be to preserve his powerful voice for generations. As for Hanks, while he is definitely one of the biggest stars in the world, there have been some rumors that he's going to eventually be voicing John Progress in an updated version of Carousel of Progress. I just don't want to stretch him out too thin in the parks, and I think that Tom Hanks, who has been described as America's dad, would fit so much better as John Progress than as the narration for Spaceship Earth. If we're talking about preserving iconic, aging voices from Disney's classic era, I couldn't think of a better duo than Mary and Bert. While we still have Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke, have them relive their tremendous chemistry by talking back and forth while guests are taken through time. As long as Dick Van Dyke doesn't try to break out into his ridiculous Cockney accent, we could be treated to the history of storytelling as told by 2 people who were probably some of our first storytellers, at least for most of us. After all, Feed the Birds is essentially a bedtime story. The pure charisma would come through the speakers like a tidal wave. I know current Disney CEO Bob Iger is good friends with Oprah Winfrey, and Winfrey has even said that if Iger were to run for president, she would be the first one in line to campaign for him. And there really hasn't been a voice that's resonated with millions of Americans quite like Oprah's. She would make perfect sense in this role, and I think it would be great to follow a trailblazing woman like Dame Judi Dench with another trailblazing woman like Oprah Winfrey. But honestly, I just don't see this one happening. Oprah really doesn't have the motivation to sit in a studio for hours and just record voice parts for theme park attractions anymore. Before he passed, I would have thought that Johnny Carson would have been a great fit. And since he's no longer with us, I think the heir apparent to his role as the most respected late night host definitely now belongs to David Letterman. It's been almost a decade since Letterman retired from his CBS show, so there's no longer a competition between Letterman and ABC/Disney. It always felt to me like Letterman, maybe more than all of the other late night hosts, seemed to show the deepest respect for the history of broadcasting, and he also seemed to be changed a great deal by fatherhood. I could see him wanting to leave something like this for his son and maybe any future grandchildren. In addition, the script would have to make mention of Johnny Carson, which I think would be a very touching moment coming from Letterman, who adored Carson. All of those names would make excellent choices, but there's one person I've had in mind for this spot ever since I heard about the update. Anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that Alan Alda has been a hero of mine since I was a very little kid. He's most famous for his role as Captain Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce in the groundbreaking sitcom MASH. Alda is another personality, though, who has been beloved by society. In 1984, a poll in Good Housekeeping magazine ranked him as the third most admired man by Americans after the president and the Pope. When David Letterman referenced the poll while Alda was on his show, the actor said, quote, "I don't know how the Pope got in there. No, I think he did something special that year," end quote. Alan Alda's voice was so memorable that more than 30 years after MASH was off the air, Bill Hader found success on Saturday Night Live doing a spot-on impression of Alda. The reason I think he would be the ideal candidate for this job is that he has started the Alda Center for Communicating Science. That has translated into television shows and now his Clear and Vivid podcast, trying to communicate complicated ideas to people who don't specialize in those fields. With a slight twist on the concept for Spaceship Earth, detailing the impact that communication has had on all human fields of study, would be a great way to move forward with the original topic of the ride. Alan Alda is 88 and has been trying to live with Parkinson's disease for a number of years now. His voice and his legacy both deserve to be preserved for a man who has spent the vast majority of his post-MASH life trying to communicate science and technology, and a man who's famous for promoting the concept of peace. He is a natural fit for Epcot. At their best, the goals for Epcot and for the Alda Center of Communication are the exact same. MASH is also a show that had a message, but always made sure to entertain audiences before it attempted to preach to the audiences. The show was so beloved that its last episode still ranks as the highest rated television program of all time, with the exception of some Super Bowls. In a world that is so divided on political lines, MASH never shied away from taking a point of view, but it used humor and emotional storytelling to keep everyone interested in the characters. Walt Disney himself said, quote, "I would rather entertain and hope that people learn something than educate people and hope they were entertained," end quote. Alan Alda's entire career could be categorized in that exact way. Who are some people you think would be good narrators for Spaceship Earth? Do you agree with any of my candidates? Or do you have someone you think would be even better? Let me know in the comments on the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. This was just a small list, so I would love to know if I missed someone deserving. Now, moving on to the ride's story, I think this is where any update would have to really be careful not to alienate people. Go too far to the Epcot stands, and you may create a one-and-done ride for new guests to the parks. If you lean too heavy into the intellectual properties, the message you're trying to convey may get lost in the spectacle of characters. Currently, the ride starts with guests getting into their time machines, picking their languages, selecting where they live off of the world map, and having their picture taken for the end of the ride. This picture is often horrible, and I'm not just saying that because I feel like I look horrible. That's going to happen with every ride picture. But it cuts off entire parts of your face and was exceptionally hideous when masks were required at the parks. My updated version of the ride will not have the same ending, instead having a fairly dull stretch of the ride replaced with more animatronic show scenes. I think we can actually get rid of the busy work tasks at the beginning of this ride. Instead, let's replace them with an onboard video that shows you how the time machine is actually carrying you back in time. Honestly, I've always found that the time machine aspect of this ride isn't very well developed, so showing the process in some way would really sell that. Even something as simple as some flashing lights like Dinosaur in Disney's Animal Kingdom would go a long way towards making sure guests understand the premise of the ride. Spaceship Earth doesn't have a pre-show, so I think a lot of riders miss this setup while getting their family organized, shuffling bags and beverages, and allowing their eyes to adjust to the darkness. At the top of the lift, Dame Judi Dench starts the narration while a projection of early humans surrounding and hunting a woolly mammoth is shown on the wall. I think this is the absolute correct way to start the ride. Humans using early forms of communication to hunt for high-calorie meals is an important progress in evolution. I would also like the narration to focus more on what these larger and more reliable meals meant to brain growth in early humans. The current progression of passing through the cave paintings, the Egyptians creating papyrus and introducing hieroglyphs, and advancing to the Phoenicians creating a common alphabet in 3 straight scenes would absolutely stay in my version of the ride. I think keeping the scenes relatively intact would be perfect, but I would add a mention of the 6,000-year-old Epic of Gilgamesh. This has the earliest known retelling of a great flood story, and it comes from Mesopotamia, an area not mentioned often in the current incarnation. If you're familiar with the current layout of the attraction, I would pull the upper-class Egyptians closer to the unknown Egyptian who's creating papyrus and move the scene of the Phoenicians a little further up the incline. That would give us a small space to reference Gilgamesh. This is a very important example of early storytelling. Of course, I would also make sure to keep the line, "Thank the Phoenicians." After the Phoenicians, I would make mention of Chinese writing characters being created and spreading the teachings of Confucius in the East. Equally great civilizations being created on opposite ends of the known world that would one day be connected by the Silk Road. I would still keep the scenes of Greek mathematicians and the Roman Empire creating a network of roads, building on the theme that Rome created the first World Wide Web with these roads. I think you take the moment to mention ideas being carried throughout the empire, including the teachings of an itinerant Jewish preacher from Palestine whose followers would later invest in forms of communication to spread his message. This is where it gets tricky because we want to stay away from the tenets of these religions, but focus on their followers and the storytelling that led to the growth of the religions. We keep the iconic smells of the burning of the library in Alexandria and continue to reference the Arab and Jewish scholars who preserved a lot of the knowledge. I would probably also include a mention of the Arabic numerals, making mathematics more accessible, and the civilization in Timbuktu that took advantage of its isolation to continue progressing through the uncertainties in Europe. It is at this point that my version of the ride veers in some dramatically different ways. Our current incarnation twists you to the top of the sphere where you rotate to, quote, return to Earth. There's space for show scenes on the descent, but that space isn't being utilized to its full potential, at least not in my opinion. This will allow me to add to the existing story while still having the space to execute it. This is the point in the ride that the Silk Road, connecting the entire known world in the same way that the Roman Empire connected the Mediterranean, would lead into the same discussion of European monks recording books by hand until the movable printing press and Gutenberg. Of course, that would jump into the Renaissance, but I would also mention, and as a Catholic, this hurts me to my core, Martin Luther. The Gutenberg Bible directly impacted the desire for lay people to read the Bible and interpret it on their own. The separation of Catholics and Protestants would also be hugely influential in the quest for land in the New World, and the splintering of more and more Protestant denominations also caused some of the more fervent factions to leave Europe for the Americas. The Gutenberg Bible is a prime example of technology influencing the storytelling apparatus, and then the storytelling apparatus having an impact on the story and how that story is received. I know a lot of us, me included, would like to keep religion out of this ride as much as possible, but the Gutenberg Bible tipped over some dominoes that had a huge impact on Western civilization that is still being felt to this day. In the current version of Spaceship Earth, it jumps from the Renaissance to newspapers covering the end of the U.S. Civil War, which I think is the biggest misstep of the one we have presently. Since storytelling is a major part of this new version, I would make sure to incorporate William Shakespeare before leaving for the Enlightenment. The Renaissance impacted the Enlightenment, and that is something that needs to be addressed. Writers with ideas as varied as Adam Smith, John Locke, Maximilian Robespierre, and Karl Marx used the availability of quick printing processes to spread ideologies that would have been unthinkable just a few generations earlier. With the spread of enlightened ideas, peoples throughout the world begin to fight back against the centuries-old domination of royalty. A group of 13 British colonies on North America break free of the ties to the empire, while newspapers published by Benjamin Franklin spread word of politics, science, and even the weather. France remakes herself multiple times until it finally creates a republic of its own. These movements lead all the way into the 20th century until kings and queens are the exceptions and not the rule. The pen proves to be mightier than the sword in spreading ideas, but oftentimes bloodshed follows, and the sword enters the picture. Journalism now involves reporting on wars. These tales often glorify war in ways that lead to more harm than good. Tolstoy writes the classic War and Peace. Books weren't always about political philosophy. The novel became a popular form of entertainment with Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Stories could take us away from the real world, or they could impact the real world. An explosion of great writers like George Bernard Shaw, James Joyce, and Oscar Wilde in Ireland inspired a new generation of people on the Emerald Isle to embrace their culture and an abolitionist woman in New England released her lone book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe used storytelling to light the spark that would eventually lead to the emancipation of enslaved African descendants in the United States. I would also at least show Frederick Douglass writing his autobiography. Even better would be to have him handing a copy to President Lincoln. This is when I would return to a lot of the themes of the current version, but with more added in between what exists now. I like the newspapers being printed to proclaim the Union victory in the Civil War. I think that would be a good tie-in with Uncle Tom's Cabin. The telegraph workers reading about the driving of the Golden Spike is also wonderful, and I would still go right into the women working the switchboards for the telephones. I would stretch the movie scene, however. Showing Jesse Owens in the Berlin Olympics is great, but I would also have Steamboat Willie, the Three Stooges, Snow White, Charlie Chaplin, Babe Ruth, and clips of the Great Depression. Of course, as somebody who has worked in radio for over 25 years, I would keep the disc jockey in the booth, but before moving to the DJ, I would also have the cover of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, with an animatronic of Woody Guthrie playing a song on the acoustic guitar. One of the things I like about the current layout of the ride is that it starts to feel like things are speeding up at this point. I want that to continue. Not all of these things need to be mentioned in the narration. Jonas Salk inventing the polio vaccine. Then it moves on to television and screen show us I Love Lucy, Walter Cronkite as an homage to an earlier version of the ride. Mickey Mouse cartoons, the Kennedy-Nixon debate in 1960, the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and then it will say how communication and storytelling led to a young Jewish man from the Midwest standing with a young black preacher from Atlanta on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to proclaim that, quote, all men are created equal. This could show Bob Dylan and Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington. Of course, after that, it goes to the family watching the moon landing and the same scientists working on the computers. I would, however, make sure they mention Dr. Valerie Thomas by name this time. At that point, we go back to the garage in California to see computers being made smaller to fit into homes. The second time your vehicle rotates towards the very end of the ride, I want guests surrounded by screens and images. Everything from Muhammad Ali proclaiming he's the greatest, to Vin Scully calling Hank Aaron's 715th home run. Billy Joel plays the Soviet Union. We see the stars gathered to record We Are the World, and Michael Jackson moonwalks and stars in Captain EO. I want to see clips from Mary Poppins, Star Wars, The Muppets, and Frozen. I want to see a part from the last episode of MASH and an episode of American Idol. Johnny Carson's iconic final moments on The Tonight Show while sitting on that stool should make way for David Letterman, Jay Leno, Conan O'Brien, Arsenio Hall, and Jon Stewart telling quick jokes. I want to see that video of Mickey Mouse standing on top of Spaceship Earth and images of protesters breaking down the Berlin Wall. When you get off the ride and enter the back of the show building, you are now surrounded by more images and statues or animatronics, and the subjects are getting closer and closer to the present. You see BTS, Guardians of the Galaxy, Shohei Ohtani, Moana, Beyonce, Billie Eilish, and Taylor Swift. You see speeches from Malala Yousafzai and Greta Thunberg. There's a segment from Hamilton. They could show clips of YouTubers and podcasters. I'm not just talking about big YouTubers and podcasters, but finding smaller creators to highlight. And this isn't just me trying to force myself onto an Epcot ride for posterity. There could be TikTok dancers and Instagram photos from Walt Disney World that day. They could update those photos each and every day using a hashtag. That would be interactive and get people a chance to feel like a part of the ride. This final room could also always be adapting so it doesn't get as stale as the current one gets towards the end of the story. A lot has happened since the events in that garage in California. Of course, this part is going to be huge, and these are just a few suggestions for what could appear at this point in the ride. I'm not sure if all of this could fit into the attraction, and compromise is always needed. There also may be important things that I just plain forgot. For example, while I tried to add more information on the Silk Road, Timbuktu, and Mesopotamia, I am still an American. I will still probably be too Americentric and Eurocentric. I would be more than happy to add more Eastern, African, and South African culture to the project. These are just some things that I thought would be missing if the general theme of the ride moved to be more about communication and storytelling. Let me know what moments from history you think should be added to Spaceship Earth. Do you think there are books I was missing? Please keep in mind that certain intellectual properties like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings won't ever show up in a Disney ride. Is there a way Disney could incorporate video games into storytelling while Universal still has the rights to Nintendo? Answer in the comments of the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. I know this is a different style of podcast than the usual conversational format. As we get closer and closer to 200 episodes, which will be a huge milestone for me, I want to find unique ways to keep things fresh. Of course, I'll always have an open invitation for my good friends and co-hosts Sarah Says and Maz. I will also look out for people raising money for charities or promoting projects. My focus on inclusion will never change, and I will try to find members of the Disney and travel communities with experiences that differ from mine. Theme parks aren't my only interest as well, and I would love to branch out on other travel topics. I'll be honest, I got a little gun shy when the last episode not to reach 1,000 views on YouTube was one in which I talked to a man who hiked the Ireland Way. Even when I returned from my own hiking trip from Ireland, I just added bonus episodes to talk about it instead of using the normal Thursday spot where you apparently expect theme park content. Either way, I appreciate you making it this far, and I think that deserves a nice comment and a like on the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Rick. As mentioned, the 2024 D23 Expo will take place August 9th through the 11th in Anaheim, California, and we will certainly be taking the time to talk about all the major announcements. I'm Sarah Says, and this has been episode 172 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Rick will be back next Thursday with another brand new episode of the show. Until then, have a great week.